Hello everyone. Now let's talk about the transport across the cell membrane. Let's first review some chemistry basics. Remember that we have three types of bonds. We have polar covalent compounds, and here the electrons are not shared equally between two atoms. So if you look at water, H2O, you will see that hydrogen has less electrons shared, so it is relatively positive if you compare it to oxygen that shares more electrons than hydrogen. So oxygen is relatively negative if you compare it to hydrogen. Water, which is a polar covalent compound, is a universal solvent. The second type of compound is ionic compound. In the ionic compounds, there are two molecules. One is negatively charged and one is positively charged, and then they are held together through the ionic bond. For example, the sodium chloride. Sodium has a positive charge, chloride has a negative charge. All of the ionic compounds dissociate in water. So ionic compounds are water soluble. So if you dissolve sodium chloride in water, sodium will be dissociated from chloride. The third type of uh, bond is non-polar covalent bond. So here the molecules share the electrons equally. That's why it's non-polar. And lipids are non-polar. The non-polar compounds are not soluble in water. They are only soluble in lipids, in non-polar compounds like them. So lipids are non-polar and only dissolve in lipids. If you look at the cell membrane, it has phospholipid bilayer. So two layers of phospholipids. And the phospholipid has a specific orientation. So there are heads and tails. The phospholipid heads are facing the exterior. So they are facing outside of the cell and inside of the cell. So they are hydrophilic because they face water. Like the cells are surrounded with water, and inside the cytoplasm of the cells also is water. The tails of the phospholipid are within the cell membrane and they are hydrophobic. They are not um, soluble in water. They are hydrophobic. So you may remember them by having phobia from water. This means what? This means that if the molecule is lipid soluble, it's gonna go easily through the cell membrane because it's able to go through the hydrophobic region, which is the tails of the phospholipids. If the molecule is not lipid soluble, like ionic compounds, they cannot go through the cell membrane directly. They have to go through channel proteins to avoid going through the lipid part of the cell membrane. Also, the cell membrane has two kinds of associated proteins, integral proteins, and they work like channels for transport for molecules that are not lipid soluble. And there are peripheral proteins. They work mainly as receptors for neurotransmitters or hormones. So the cell membrane is selectively permeable. So it allows some molecules to go through and prevents some from going through. What goes easily through the cell membrane are lipid-soluble substances like fatty acids, steroids, fat-soluble vitamins, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. All of these are water soluble, so they can go easily through the hydrophobic part of the cell membrane. The non-lipid soluble molecules are not easily in. They have to go through certain channels because they can to go through the lipid part of the cell membrane. Like ions, charged particles, glucose, they go through certain channels. We have two primary types of transport through the cell membrane: passive transport and active transport. What is the difference? In passive transport, no energy is needed. So it happens in a passive way without the need of any energy. In case of active transport, here we need an energy in the form of ATP. So ATP is consumed in active transport, but not in passive transport. There are three types of passive transport: the simple or passive diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and water diffusion that we call osmosis. Let's first go with the simple diffusion. So it is a passive process, so no energy is needed. And here the materials move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. For example, if you have sugar in water and you wait some time, you will see that the sugar will dissolve completely in water. So it's going to go from this area of high concentration to be equally distributed in water. So if you look at here, there is a membrane between two sites. This site has higher concentration of a certain solute, and this has lower concentration. And you will allow them to diffuse for some time. Then the molecules go from the higher concentration site to the lower concentration site until the distribution is equal across both sides of the membrane. Okay, how molecules go through the cell membrane? If they are lipid solubles, they will go directly through the cell membrane, like oxygen, carbon dioxide, steroid hormones. If they are not lipid soluble, like ions, sodium chloride, calcium, potassium, they must go through certain channels, so they avoid going through the lipid part of the cell membrane. The second type of passive diffusion that does not need energy is facilitated diffusion. Facilitated means it needs a facilitator, it needs a helper. Also, movements of molecules happens in a passive way from areas of high concentration to lower concentration areas. For example, the glucose is a heavy molecule, so it must be carried with a certain carrier to be able to move. We call that facilitated diffusion. So it's carried with certain protein carriers. So here, for example, our glucose molecules, and to be absorbed, it has to be carried through this carrier, and then this carrier will revolve to allow the molecule to go from out to in the cell. So ask yourself this question: what will happen if we increase the number of carriers to the rate of diffusion? If we increase the number of carriers, of course, the rate of facilitated diffusion will increase. The more carriers you have, the more rate of diffusion. So here our carriers are transport proteins, and sometimes they need to be embedded within the cell membrane when we need to. For example, in case of glucose facilitated diffusion, the carriers are called GLUT4 transporters. And as you do physical exercise, your skeletal muscles need more sugar to give an energy to move. So carriers will go to be inserted into the cell membrane of your skeletal muscles so that they allow more glucose to enter the cell. So what happens as you do physical exercise is that you are increasing the number of protein carriers that carry glucose from out to inside of skeletal muscle cells. That's why physical exercise is good in diabetic patients, because as they do physical exercise, more transporters, more GLUT4 transporters are inserted in their skeletal muscle cell membranes, and they take glucose from the blood into their skeletal muscle cells. So this will lower the blood glucose level. So what are the factors affecting the rate of diffusion, which is the passive process? Number one is the concentration gradient or concentration difference. The more the difference, the faster the diffusion. So, for example, suppose we have three scenarios, and in the first scenario, this is side A and B. Suppose in side A we have 8 molar of sodium, and inside B, we have only 2 molar of sodium. In the second scenario, on side A, we have 6 molar of sodium, and on the other side, we have 3 molar of sodium. In the third case, in side A, we have 10 molar of sodium, and in the other side, we have 2 molar of sodium. Which one has the highest rate of diffusion? You need to calculate the concentration difference. So in case number one, here it's 8 minus 2, so the difference is 6 molar of sodium. And in the second scenario, it's 6 minus 3, so it's 3 molar. And in the third case, it's 10 minus 2, so it's 8. So the third scenario has the fastest rate of diffusion, followed by the first one, followed by the second scenario. Why? Because this third case that has 10 molar in one side and 2 on the other side has the highest difference between the two sides. The second thing that increases the rate of diffusion is the degree of lipid solubility. The more lipid soluble molecules are faster to diffuse through the cell membrane because they go directly without the need for channels or transporters. Number three, the molecular weight. It makes sense that smaller molecules are faster than the greater ones. All of these variables apply to both diffusion as well as facilitated diffusion. In facilitated diffusion, there is another thing that affects the rate of facilitated diffusion, which is the number of carriers. The more carriers, the faster the rate of facilitated diffusion. Let's go over these review sheet questions about this part. So for number 8, underline the right word. Lipids or fats are examples of hydrophobic or hydrophilic. Well, lipids are not water soluble, so they are hydrophobic. Lipids are non-polar. They share the electrons equally, so they are non-polar. Number 9, moving of molecules from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. This is not passive diffusion, because in passive diffusion, the molecules go from higher to lower concentration easily without energy, like going downstairs. If you go upstairs, it's actually more difficult. So this needs more energy. So you may remember it this way. So if molecules go from lower to higher concentration, that is active transport. And active transport needs energy in the form of ATP. So here, ATP molecules are used to provide energy in case of active transport. Diffusion of particles through a membrane by means of carrier molecules is called what? This is facilitated diffusion. And here we need carriers to help the molecules go through the cell membrane. And our example is movement of glucose molecules across the cell membrane.